Chapter 3: What the War Left Behind, the Peace That Never Reached the Coast. To understand the world Catherine Diaz was born into and that shaped everything around her childhood, you have to go backward first. Not far backward by the standards of national history, but far enough to feel the weight of what had happened. The Civil War that officially ended in 1992 had been building for decades out of conditions that did not appear suddenly. El Salvador had long been a country of extreme inequality, organized around land ownership, which is the oldest and most durable form of power in agrarian economies. The Catorce Familias, the 14 families, though the number was always more symbolic than precise, controlled the coffee and sugar plantations that made up the bulk of the formal economy. The campesinos who worked those lands owned almost nothing. When global coffee prices collapsed in the late 1920s, the plantation owners cut wages. When landless farmers protested and organized, the government's response in 1932 was a massacre. Somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 indigenous and campesino people killed in what Salvadorans still call La Matanza, the slaughter. The leader of the uprising, Agustin Farabundo Marti, was executed by firing squad. His name would reappear 50 years later as the FMLN, the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, the guerrilla coalition that fought the Civil War. History in El Salvador does not disappear. It goes underground and waits. The war. The Civil War that began in 1979 emerged from those ancient inequalities, meeting a moment of global Cold War ideology. The FMLN, a coalition of several Marxist-aligned guerrilla groups, fought against the Salvadoran government and military, who received enormous support, money, weapons, military training, political backing from the United States, which saw El Salvador as a front in the global struggle against communism and cared very little about the specific human costs of that particular battlefield. The U.S. government funded and trained the Salvadoran military while largely ignoring or actively suppressing evidence of the atrocities that military committed. Congress was told one thing. The people of El Salvador experienced something else entirely. On December 11, 1981, soldiers from the Atlacatl Battalion, one of the first units trained by U.S. Special Forces advisors, arrived in the mountain village of El Mozote in Morazan Department. What happened over the following 2 days became one of the worst massacres in modern Latin American history. Approximately 900 civilians were killed, men executed in the central square, women raped and murdered, children, including infants, killed in a schoolhouse where soldiers burned the building with the children inside. A woman named Rufina Amaya, who had hidden beneath a bush and watched through the darkness while her children called for her from inside the building where they would die, survived to testify to what had happened. The Salvadoran government and the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador denied the massacre. The Reagan administration certified twice yearly to Congress that El Salvador was making progress on human rights, a legal requirement for continued U.S. aid, while the killing continued. By the time the Chapultepec Peace Accords were signed in Mexico City on January 16, 1992, roughly 75,000 people had died in the war, and approximately 85% of the documented atrocities had been committed by the military and paramilitary forces supported by the United States. The peace that didn't heal the Chapultepec Accords were celebrated internationally as a diplomatic success, a model for negotiated settlement of civil wars. A ceasefire took effect. The FMLN transformed into a political party. The military was reformed. Land reform was attempted. International donors sent reconstruction money. None of this repaired what had been broken. Families who had lost members to death squads or massacres received, in most cases, no acknowledgement that a crime had even occurred. The same officers who oversaw atrocities were often given comfortable retirements rather than prosecution. The amnesty law passed by the Salvadoran legislature in 1993, 5 days after the UN Truth Commission report was published, ensured that almost no one was ever held legally accountable for the killings. This is not a small detail in the psychology of a nation. When a society is told that the worst things that happen to it will not be investigated, named, or punished, the trauma doesn't dissolve. It becomes structural. It embeds itself in institutions, in families, in the specific quality of silence that descended over Salvadoran dinner tables whenever certain subjects arose. In the coastal communities where Katie Diaz grew up, the war's impact was felt differently than in the mountains of Morazan or the cities where guerrilla fighting and death squad violence had been most intense. The fishing villages along La Libertad were not major battlegrounds, but the coast is not separate from a country it belongs to. Men from these communities had been conscripted into the military. Families had fled inland violence to the relative openness of the coast. The economic devastation of the war reached everywhere.